England, 1824. Some women are forged in fire long before the flames ever touch them. Margaret Fairmont stood in the pre-dawn darkness of the market square, her worn gloves concealing hands that had once been soft enough for pianoforte and embroidery. The April morning carried the sharp bite of lingering winter, and her breath misted in the air as she approached the fishmonger's stall. Around her, the village of Helmsley stirred to life with the creaking of cartwheels and the distant lowing of cattle being driven to pasture. "That batch there," she said, gesturing to a crate of mackerel that had clearly seen better days. The silvery scales had dulled to grey, and the smell spoke of fish caught 3 days past rather than this morning. "What price?" The fishmonger, a red-faced man named Dobbs, who had known her since childhood, looked away uncomfortably. "Miss Harrington, I cannot in good conscience sell you spoiled fish." "They are not entirely spoiled," Meg replied, with the quiet dignity that had become her armour against pity. "Merely past their prime. Cooked thoroughly with onions and herbs, they will serve well enough. The children need protein, Mr. Dobbs, and our budget does not extend to fresh catches." The children. Always the children. 12 souls ranging from 4 to 14 years old, all residing in the crumbling stone building on the edge of the Duke of Northmere's vast estate. St. Catherine's Orphanage had stood there for near on 80 years, a testament to some long-dead duchess's charitable impulse. Now it housed the forgotten, the unwanted, the children whose parents had succumbed to fever or accident or simple despair. And it housed Margaret Fairmont, daughter of the late Viscount Fairmont, who 3 years ago had drowned himself in the River Rye when his gambling debts had finally exceeded his ability to conjure excuses. 3 shillings for the lot," Dobbs said finally, his voice gruff with discomfort. "And do not tell my wife I sold them to you. She will have my head for undermining proper prices." Your kindness will not be forgotten," Meg replied, counting out the coins with fingers that trembled slightly from the cold, or perhaps from hunger. Breakfast had been weak tea and a heel of bread, saved from yesterday's meagre supper. As she hefted the crate, careful not to let the weight show on her face, a voice cut through the morning bustle. "Good Lord, is that Margaret Fairmont carrying fish like a common scullery maid?" Lady Beatrice Thornbury stood beneath the awning of the draper's shop, her fashionable pelisse buttoned against the chill, her companion Mrs. Hartford nodding in scandalised agreement beside her. "One would think," Lady Beatrice continued, raising her voice to ensure it carried across the square, "that after 3 years of disgrace, she might have the decency to remove herself from polite society entirely. Instead, she parades about in worn clothing, bargaining for refuse like some cheapside fishwife." Meg felt the familiar burn of shame creep up her neck, but she kept her spine straight and her gaze forward. There had been a time when she might have offered a cutting retort, when the name Fairmont had still carried weight enough to silence such remarks. That time had died with her father in the cold waters of the Rye. The children at St. Catherine's are fortunate to have someone willing to swallow pride for their sake, came a new voice, deep and measured. "It speaks to character that some in this village seem to lack." Meg turned, nearly dropping the crate in her surprise. A gentleman stood near the baker's stall, tall enough that he seemed to loom over the morning crowd. His greatcoat was cut from wool so fine it could only have come from London, and his posture spoke of military bearing despite the civilian clothes. But it was his face that arrested her attention, sharp-featured and severe, with eyes the colour of winter ice that seemed to assess and categorise everything they touched. William Grey, Duke of Northmere. She had never seen him in person before. The Duke rarely visited his northern properties, preferring to manage them through stewards and solicitors from his primary seat in Derbyshire. Yet here he stood, regarding Lady Beatrice with the sort of cold disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant discovered on one's boot heel. "Your Grace," Lady Beatrice stammered, her face flushing crimson. "I did not realise you had arrived in Helmsley." "Clearly," the Duke replied, his tone suggesting this was not a point in her favour. "I arrived late last evening to review certain property matters, though I confess I did not expect my first morning to include witnessing supposed gentlewomen mocking those who sacrifice comfort to care for orphaned children." Mrs. Hartford looked as though she might faint. Lady Beatrice managed a weak curtsy before fleeing toward her waiting carriage with as much dignity as haste would allow. The Duke's gaze moved to Meg, and she found herself subjected to that same assessing stare. For a moment that stretched uncomfortably long, neither spoke. Then he inclined his head, the barest acknowledgement of her existence, and continued on his way toward the posting inn where his carriage waited. Meg stood frozen, the crate of fish growing heavier in her arms, trying to understand what had just occurred. The Duke of Northmere had defended her. The same Duke whose land she occupied, whose steward sent quarterly reminders that St. Catherine's existed purely by his grace and could be vacated at any moment. Well, Dobbs muttered, shaking his head in wonder, that will give the gossips something to chew on for weeks. Indeed, it would. But Meg had more immediate concerns than village gossip. She had 12 children to feed, lessons to prepare, and the constant, grinding worry of how to keep them all clothed and sheltered when charity grew thinner with each passing season. She did not see the Duke's carriage pause at the corner, or the way his gaze followed her slight figure as she made her way up the rutted lane towards St. Catherine's. She did not know that William Grey had observed her entire exchange with Dobbs, had noted the careful way she had counted her coins, the practiced manner in which she had disguised the weight of the crate. But she would learn soon enough that the Duke of Northmere missed very little, and that his attention, once captured, was not easily diverted. St. Catherine's Orphanage squatted on a slight rise overlooking the valley, its grey stone walls streaked with moss, and its slate roof missing tiles in several places. The building had been constructed in some earlier century, when solid walls and small windows were valued over comfort, and the years had not been kind to it. Still, Meg had done what she could, with whitewash and determination, and the windows sparkled clean, even if the frames were rotting. "Miss Meg!" Tommy Burke burst through the front door, his 6-year-old face alight with the sort of energy that only small boys possessed before breakfast. "Sarah says we are having fish today. Real fish, not just porridge." "Indeed we are," Meg replied, ruffling his dark hair with her free hand, "though you must help carry in the firewood before lessons if you wish to eat any." Behind Tommy, the other children emerged in various states of wakefulness. Sarah Michaels, at 14 the eldest, had already organised the younger ones into their morning chores. James and Peter hauled buckets from the well while little Anne helped set the long table in the kitchen. This was their rhythm, carved out of necessity and maintained through the sheer force of routine. The day proceeded as most did, filled with 1,000 small tasks required to keep 12 children fed, clean, and educated. Meg heard recitations of multiplication tables, mediated disputes over whose turn it was to feed the chickens, and repaired a torn hem on Peter's only spare shirt. The fish, boiled with the last of their onions, made an adequate midday meal, and she tried not to calculate how many days remained until their next small allocation from the parish. It was late afternoon when young James came running from the lane, waving a folded paper sealed with red wax. "Miss Meg, a man on a horse delivered this. He said it was official business from the Duke's estate office." Meg's hands stilled over the mending in her lap. Official business was never good news. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper. The words blurred at first, then snapped into sharp focus with the cruelty of a slap. Notice of termination of tenancy. The occupants of the structure known as St. Catherine's Orphanage were hereby informed that said property would be required for alternative commercial purposes. 60 days were granted for complete vacation of the premises. No exceptions would be considered. Signed by Edmund Whitmore, estate manager for His Grace the Duke of Northmere. 60 days. 2 months to find new housing for 12 children. To secure funding. To somehow conjure a miracle from empty pockets and exhausted goodwill. "Miss Meg." Sarah's voice was soft with worry. "What does it say?" Meg folded the paper carefully, smoothing the creases with methodical precision. When she looked up, her face was composed into the same serene mask she had worn when receiving news of her father's death, when being turned out of her childhood home by Hugh, when watching her last piece of jewellery sold to pay for medicine. "It says we shall be moving, Sarah. An adventure for us all." But that night, alone in her small room beneath the eaves, Margaret Fairmont allowed herself the luxury of tears. She wept silently, as she had learned to do, her face pressed into the thin pillow that smelled of lavender she had dried last summer. She wept for the children who had already lost so much, for the building that had become their home, for the constant crushing weight of responsibility she carried alone. And she wept because somewhere in her traitorous heart she had allowed herself a moment of hope when the Duke had defended her in the market square, as though a single gesture of casual kindness meant anything at all when measured against the cold mathematics of property and profit. By morning, the tears had dried. Meg rose with the dawn, splashed her face with cold water from the basin, and began composing a letter requesting an audience with the estate manager. If Whitmore would not listen, she would appeal directly to the Duke himself. She had sacrificed her pride long ago on the altar of these children's welfare. She would beg if she must, plead if it would help, prostrate herself before ducal authority if that was what survival required. Some women were forged in fire long before the flames ever touched them, but they could still burn. The week that followed the eviction notice passed in a blur of desperate activity. Meg visited every charitable organisation within a day's travel of Helmsley, each meeting ending with the same polite refusals couched in sympathetic language. The parish vestry expressed deep concern, but pointed to their already strained resources. The Ladies' Benevolent Society listened with apparent interest before explaining that their funds were committed through the following year. Even the Quaker meeting house, usually generous with the poor, could offer nothing beyond prayers and a basket of preserves. "You understand our position, Miss Fairmont," Mrs. Lydia Crawford explained from behind her ornate tea service, her drawing room a testament to wealth that could have housed 12 children comfortably. "With your family's unfortunate history, association with your cause might reflect poorly on our charitable endeavours. People talk, you understand." Meg understood perfectly. The stain of her father's suicide and debts had spread like spilled ink, colouring everything it touched. Hugh Carrington had made certain of that, whispering in the right ears, ensuring that his cousin's fall from grace remained fresh in society's memory. She had 3 potential buildings identified within their impossibly limited means. The first was a former coaching inn in the village of Thorndale, its roof half collapsed and its interior reeking of damp and decay. The second was a converted barn on the outskirts of Ripon, structurally sound, but requiring £180 in repairs before it could legally house children. The third was a cottage that might have accommodated 6 people comfortably, but would leave 12 children sleeping in shifts. "We could manage the cottage," Sarah suggested one evening, as they reviewed their options by candlelight, the younger children already abed. "The older ones could sleep in the loft, and we could partition the main room." "For 60 days, perhaps," Meg replied, running calculations in the margins of her worn ledger. "But Sarah, think of winter. Think of illness spreading in such close quarters. We would lose children to fever before spring." The girl's face crumpled with worry beyond her 14 years. "Then what do we do, Miss Meg?" "We find a way," Meg said, with more conviction than she felt. "We always have before." But finding a way became increasingly difficult as Hugh's campaign of sabotage intensified. Word of her charity drive had reached him, and he moved with calculated malice to undermine her efforts. When she arranged a small fundraising bazaar at the church hall, he convinced the vicar's wife that such an event would be unseemly given the Fairmont family's disgrace. When she sought an appointment with Lord Pemberton, Hugh's friend and frequent gambling companion, she received a curt note declining the meeting without explanation. It was in the market square, 3 weeks after receiving the eviction notice, that matters came to an ugly head. Meg had just purchased thread for mending, counting out her coins with the care of someone for whom every penny carried weight, when Hugh materialised beside her like a malevolent spectre. "Cousin Margaret," he said loudly enough to draw attention from nearby shoppers. "Still playing at charity work, I see. How noble of you to sacrifice yourself so thoroughly for the unwashed masses." "Mr. Carrington," Meg replied evenly, gathering her packages and preparing to leave. She had learned that engaging with Hugh only encouraged his cruelty. But he stepped into her path, his expression twisted with something that might have been jealousy or simply meanness given form. "You know, I have been thinking about your predicament. A woman of your age, unmarried and without prospects, surely there are other ways you might secure the funds you need. Ways that require less pride and more practical application of your feminine resources. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Around them, conversations faltered as people turned to witness the exchange. Meg felt heat crawl up her neck, but she kept her voice level. I believe you should step aside, Mr. Carrington. We have nothing further to discuss, do we not? Hugh's smile was ugly. I merely suggest that a woman willing to debase herself by living among orphans and begging for coins might consider other forms of debasement that pay rather better. There are gentlemen who prefer a certain maturity in their companions, I understand. That is quite enough. The voice cut through the growing crowd with the precision of a blade. William Gray emerged from the saddler's shop, his expression carved from Arctic stone. Mr. Carrington, you will apologize to Miss Fairmont immediately, or you and I shall have a very different conversation. Hugh paled, but pride warred with good sense on his features. Your Grace, I meant no offense. I was merely offering familial advice to my cousin regarding her unfortunate situation. You were offering insult to a woman who demonstrates more character in her smallest finger than you possess in your entire being. William's tone could have frozen the Thames. Now apologize, or leave Helmsley before nightfall. I own most of this village, Mr. Carrington, and I can make continued residence here remarkably unpleasant for those who displease me. The threat was unmistakable. Hugh managed a strangled apology before retreating to his horse, his face mottled with rage and humiliation, but not before Meg caught the look he directed at her, a promise of retribution that made her blood run cold. When the crowd had dispersed, returning to their business with the satisfied air of people who had witnessed excellent theatre, William turned to Meg. Up close, his eyes were even more striking. Pale blue shot through with grey like winter sky before snow. Are you unharmed, Miss Fairmont? Quite unharmed, Your Grace, Meg replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her packages. Though I fear you have made an enemy on my behalf. Carrington was already my enemy the moment he revealed himself to be a man who would threaten women in public squares. William paused, seeming to weigh his next words. I understand you are seeking alternative housing for St. Catherine's. I am, Your Grace, though I confess the search has proven more difficult than anticipated. Indeed, his expression remained unreadable. 60 days is not a generous time frame. No, Your Grace, it is not. For a moment, she thought he might relent, might offer the extension she desperately needed, but he merely inclined his head in farewell and continued on his way, leaving Meg to wonder if his defense of her had been merely reflex good manners rather than genuine concern. That night, Tommy Burke woke screaming with fever. By dawn, his small body burned hot enough to frighten even Sarah, who had nursed younger siblings through illness before. Meg sent Peter running for Dr. Marsden, the village physician, and spent the morning bathing Tommy's forehead with cool cloths while he thrashed in delirium. Dr. Marsden arrived near noon, his fee of 2 shillings demanded before he would examine the boy. Meg paid it from their grocery fund and watched anxiously as he conducted his examination. Lung fever, the doctor pronounced grimly. The boy needs laudanum for the pain and willow bark tea every 4 hours. Keep him cool and pray. It will either break in 3 days or take him. The medicines cost another shilling. Meg watched their remaining funds dwindle to almost nothing and tried not to calculate how many meals they would have to stretch or skip to make it through the month. For 2 days, Tommy lingered in that terrible space between life and death. Meg slept in a chair beside his bed, waking every few hours to administer medicine and check his breathing. On the 3rd morning, when she had almost resigned herself to digging another small grave in the churchyard, a carriage arrived bearing a gentleman in expensive clothing, who introduced himself as Dr. Harrison from York. I was asked to examine the boy, he said, producing a leather bag of instruments that made Dr. Marsden's battered case look medieval by comparison. Asked by whom? Meg demanded, though hope fluttered treacherously in her chest. We cannot afford a specialist, Dr. Harrison. My fee has been paid, Miss Fairmont. Now please, let me see the patient. Dr. Harrison's examination was thorough and professional. He prescribed different medicines, showed Meg more effective cooling techniques, and promised to return the following day. True to his word, he came daily for a week, until Tommy's fever broke and colour returned to his thin cheeks. When Meg tried to discover who had hired him, Dr. Harrison would only say that his benefactor wished to remain anonymous. But she knew. The timing, the quality of care, the casual dismissal of cost, all pointed to one man. She found William Gray reviewing property maps in the estate office, his coat discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled up in a manner that seemed shockingly informal for a duke. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his features before being replaced by cool courtesy. "Miss Fairmont, I was not expecting visitors. I have come to thank you for sending Dr. Harrison to Tommy," Meg said without preamble. "Though you deny it, I know it was you." "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. Your Grace, please. Do not insult my intelligence with false denials. The boy would have died without proper care." William set down his pen, his expression unreadable. If someone of means chose to assist a sick child, that person would likely prefer their charity to remain private, to prevent expectations of continued assistance that might prove burdensome. The message was clear. Do not expect this kindness to become habit. Do not presume upon ducal generosity. Meg felt something twist painfully in her chest, gratitude and disappointment warring for dominance. "Of course, Your Grace. Forgive my presumption." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "How is the boy?" "Recovering, Your Grace. Thanks to excellent medical care." "Good," William said quietly. "That is good." The moments stretched between them, fragile as spun glass, before Meg curtsied and departed. She did not see the way William stared at the closed door long after she had gone, or the calculations he was running that had nothing to do with property values and everything to do with a woman whose pride and determination had carved themselves into his carefully controlled life. The calendar on Meg's desk marked 35 days remaining until eviction, each crossed-off date a reminder of time slipping through her fingers like sand. The converted barn in Thorndale had seemed promising until closer inspection revealed not just a sagging roof, but walls undermined by years of neglect. The estimate for repairs had come back at £180, a sum that might as well have been 18,000 for all her ability to conjure it. "We could write to churches in York," Sarah suggested during their evening council. The older children gathered around the scarred kitchen table while the younger ones slept upstairs. "Perhaps someone there might help." "I have written to 17 parishes," Meg replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at her bones. 3 responded with prayers. The rest did not answer at all. James, 13 and trying desperately to seem useful, straightened in his chair. "I could take work, Miss Meg. The blacksmith said he might need an apprentice." "You are too young for smithing, James, and we need you here." Meg softened her refusal with a smile. "But I appreciate your willingness to help." The truth was that every avenue seemed blocked, every door closed before she could properly knock. But surrender was not in Meg's nature, forged as it had been through 3 years of finding ways when no way seemed to exist. If genteel charity would not provide, then she would organise something herself. The charity bazaar took shape over the following week. Meg convinced the vicar to allow use of the church hall, persuaded local merchants to donate items for sale, and recruited the older orphans to create handicrafts they might sell. Sarah proved surprisingly talented at embroidery, while Peter carved small wooden animals that showed genuine skill. Even little Anne contributed, painting wildflowers on pieces of salvaged pottery, with the concentrated focus of the very young. "If we raise £80, we could at least secure the barn and begin basic repairs," Meg calculated, her ledger covered in increasingly desperate arithmetic. "The parish might contribute another 20, and I could approach Lord Pemberton again." But she had underestimated Hugh's capacity for malice and his connections among Helmsley's social elite. The first warning came when Mrs. Crawford withdrew her promised donation of preserves and baked goods. Then Lady Beatrice Thornbury cancelled her commitment to provide tea service. By the day before the bazaar, half the expected donors had mysteriously reconsidered, and whispers suggested that Hugh Carrington had been visiting drawing rooms throughout the county. "He told Mrs. Hartford that supporting your bazaar would be tantamount to encouraging vice," the vicar's wife reported reluctantly when Meg pressed for information. Something about your family's history of financial impropriety making you unfit to handle charitable funds. The bazaar proceeded anyway, held in the drafty church hall with its meagre offerings spread across borrowed tables. The attendance was sparse, comprised mainly of farmers' wives and tradespeople, who came more from kindness than any real expectation of quality goods. At day's end, when Meg counted the proceeds with hands that trembled slightly, the total came to £12, 7 shillings. Not enough. Not nearly enough. That night, Meg allowed herself the dangerous luxury of despair. She sat alone in her small room, the ledger open before her, and faced the mathematical certainty that they could not survive this. Even if she found housing, even if she stretched every penny until it screamed, they lacked the fundamental resources to start again. Across the valley, in the Duke's temporary residence, William Gray wrestled with his own calculations of a very different sort. The Liverpool investors are firm on their timeline, Edmund Whitmore explained, shuffling through documents on William's desk. They want construction begun within 60 days, or they'll take their capital elsewhere. The property values in this region depend on industrial development, Your Grace. Without the textile mill, the entire economic forecast shifts downward. William stared at the maps spread before him, showing his vast holdings in Yorkshire and Derbyshire, inherited from a father who had spent far more than he earned and left the duchy teetering on the edge of ruin. 5 years of careful management had stabilized their position, but barely. Every decision carried weight, every choice between sentiment and profit, a calculation with real consequences for tenants, workers, entire villages. What if we offered them the eastern parcel instead? William asked, indicating an alternative plot. Similar access to the river, flat enough for construction. Whitmore frowned. That would require new surveys, new architectural plans. The investors would certainly extend their construction timeline, possibly by 6 months. And Carrington's commission depends on the sale completing within the original 60-day window. Yes, Your Grace. If we modify the terms, he forfeits his broker's fee. Whitmore paused. Though I confess, I fail to see why that concerns us. Carrington is an unpleasant opportunist who happens to be well connected. William rose and moved to the window, watching distant lights from the village twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in that darkness was St. Catherine's, with its 12 children and 1 woman who refused to surrender despite impossible odds. Prepare the alternative proposal, William said finally. I'll present it to the Liverpool investors myself and inform Miss Fairmont that she has 90 additional days to secure new housing. Your Grace, Whitmore said carefully, may I ask what prompted this change of heart? The financial implications are not insignificant. No, they are not. William's reflection in the dark glass showed a man he barely recognized, one who made decisions based on conscience rather than pure calculation. But neither is the moral cost of displacing children for commercial gain when alternatives exist. The notification reached Meg the following morning, delivered by a rider in the Duke's livery. She read it 3 times, certain she must be misunderstanding the formal language. An alternative site had been secured for the textile mill. The eviction timeline was extended by 90 days. The Duke's office remained available should she require assistance in her relocation efforts. 90 days, Sarah breathed when Meg shared the news. That's nearly summer. We can find something in 90 days, can't we, Miss Meg? Perhaps, Meg replied, though her mind was racing through different calculations entirely. Why would the Duke reverse his decision? What had changed between the cold dismissal of her appeal and this unexpected reprieve? She found her answer that afternoon when Hugh Carrington appeared at St. Catherine's Gate, his face mottled with rage. You think yourself very clever, he snarled without preamble, manipulating the Duke with whatever feminine wiles you possess. But you have cost me £800, cousin, and I do not forget such things. I have manipulated nothing, Meg replied, maintaining distance between herself and Hugh's obvious fury. If the Duke chose to alter his plans, that decision was his alone. Was it? Hugh's laugh was ugly. Convenient timing, is it not? He defends you in the market, sends his expensive physician to your sick brat, and now reorganizes a major commercial venture to accommodate your sob story. Either you are bedding him, or you soon will be. And either way, you have demonstrated that the Fairmont women know how to trade on their backs when necessity demands. The slap came before Meg realized her hand had moved, cracking across Hugh's cheek with enough force to snap his head sideways. The shock of it vibrated up her arm, followed immediately by horror at her own loss of control. "Get off my property," she said, her voice shaking. "Now!" Hugh touched his reddening cheek, his smile turning predatory. "Ah, there's the spirit. Perhaps there is some Fairmont fire left in you after all. Be careful, cousin. Pride goes before a fall, and you have very far to fall indeed." He departed, but his words lingered like poison, making Meg question everything. Had she somehow encouraged the Duke's interest? Had her acceptance of his anonymous charity created obligations she had not intended? She had no answers, only the growing certainty that she needed to thank William properly and perhaps understand his motivations more clearly. The Duke's estate office sat in a converted manor house a mile from Helmsley's centre, surrounded by formal gardens that showed the precise organisation of a military mind. Meg approached with her heart hammering, uncertain what she would say but knowing the conversation was necessary. William looked up from property maps spread across a massive desk, surprise flickering across his features before settling into careful neutrality. His coat hung on a chair, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows in a manner that suggested he had forgotten formality in favour of function. The sight of his bare forearms, corded with muscle beneath sun-bronzed skin, created an unexpected flutter in Meg's chest that she firmly ignored. "Miss Fairmont," he said, rising. "This is unexpected. I apologise for arriving unannounced, Your Grace." Meg remained near the door, suddenly aware of the impropriety of seeking private audience with a bachelor duke. "I came to thank you for the extended timeline. Your generosity has given us hope." "It was a business decision," William replied, his tone carefully neutral. "The alternative site serves equally well." "Does it?" Meg challenged gently. "Or did it serve as justification for a decision your conscience demanded?" For a long moment, William said nothing, his pale eyes searching her face for something she could not name. Then he gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. We should speak plainly." Once they were both seated, the desk a barrier between them that seemed both necessary and insufficient, William leaned back and regarded her with unsettling directness. "You are correct that conscience played a role," he admitted. "I find that the mathematics of profit and loss become complicated when actual human costs are calculated. Displacing 12 children for marginal gain in property values began to seem less like sound business and more like moral cowardice." "Yet you face real financial pressures," Meg said, remembering gossip about the late Duke's profligacy. "I do not wish to be the cause of difficulties for your estates. My difficulties are my own to manage, Miss Fairmont. Your concern is finding permanent housing for St. Catherine's, which remains as impossible as before," Meg confessed, the words escaping before pride could prevent them. 90 days merely delays the inevitable. I have no resources, no prospects, and society has made clear that my father's sins extend to his orphaned daughter." William's expression darkened. "Society is composed largely of fools who mistake breeding for character. Your father's financial failures do not diminish your own worth. Do they not?" Bitterness crept into Meg's voice. "I am 28 years old, unmarried, living in poverty while caring for children not my own. By every measure society employs, I am a failure. Then society's measures are profoundly flawed." William rose and moved to the window, his back to her, tension visible in his shoulders. "You care for orphans when you might have pursued your own comfort. You maintain dignity despite deliberate humiliation. You fight for those weaker than yourself when surrender would be easier. These seem to me the actions of someone possessing genuine nobility, regardless of circumstances or title." The unexpected praise landed like a physical blow, bringing tears to Meg's eyes that she blinked away furiously. When had anyone last spoken to her with such respect? Seen her as more than an object of pity or scorn? "Your Grace," she began. But he turned suddenly, crossing the space between them with surprising speed. "William," he said quietly. "When we are private, you might call me William." The intimacy of it stole her breath. "That would be most improper." "Yes," he agreed. And something in his expression, made her heart skip. It would be. They stood too close, propriety abandoned somewhere between formal address and Christian names. Meg could see gold flecks in his blue eyes, could smell sandalwood and leather and something uniquely him. The air between them seemed to thicken with possibility, with something dangerous and utterly inappropriate. "I should go," Meg whispered, but her feet refused to move. "You should," William agreed, making no effort to step back. The moment stretched, fragile and charged, until voices in the outer office shattered it. William moved away first, clearing his throat and gesturing toward the door. "I'll have my secretary draw up documents regarding available properties on my land that might suit your needs," he said formally, but his voice carried a roughness that had not been there before. "Perhaps we can find a more permanent solution. Thank you, Your Grace." Meg curtsied mechanically and fled before her racing heart could betray her further. She did not see William slump into his chair after she left, did not witness the way he pressed his palms against his eyes as though trying to clear vision clouded by something beyond logic or reason, did not hear him whisper to the empty room, "What am I doing?" But she carried home with her the memory of his voice speaking her name and the dangerous warmth it had kindled in her carefully guarded heart. 70 days remained on the calendar, a number that should have brought relief, but instead carried the weight of borrowed time. The extended deadline had changed nothing fundamental about their situation, merely postponed the inevitable reckoning. Meg knew this, felt it in the hollow spaces between heartbeats, yet she continued the exhausting charade of optimism for the children's sake. What she did not know was that across the valley, in a cramped room above the Three Crowns Tavern, Hugh Carrington sat with his head in his hands, surrounded by increasingly threatening letters from his creditors. £800. The commission from brokering the textile mill sale would have cleared his gambling debts with enough remaining to invest in a profitable scheme his London associates had proposed. Instead, the Duke's interference had cost him everything, and Hugh's creditors were not patient men. Already he had sold his better horses, pawned his father's watch, and borrowed against next quarter's rents from the Fairmont estates. The walls were closing in, and Hugh could see only one person responsible for his ruin. Margaret Fairmont, with her false dignity and manipulative charity work, had somehow bewitched the Duke into abandoning sound business for sentimental nonsense. Women like her were dangerous, Hugh reasoned through his third glass of inferior brandy, using feminine wiles to corrupt men's judgment. She needed to be taught a lesson, removed as an obstacle, eliminated so the natural order could reassert itself. The idea came to him slowly, fueled by desperation and alcohol. If St. Catherine's were destroyed, the Duke would have no reason to delay development. The Liverpool investors would return, a new broker might be appointed, and Hugh could position himself to recapture some portion of his lost opportunity. More importantly, Meg would be left with nothing, forced to scatter her orphans among workhouses and accept the defeat she had so stubbornly refused. Fire, Hugh decided, was the answer. An accident with a lamp, perhaps. Something tragically believable that would leave no questions and no culpability. At St. Catherine's, Meg noticed the stranger first on a Tuesday evening, as twilight painted the valley in shades of amber and shadow. A man she did not recognize stood near the stone wall marking their property boundary, appearing to study the building with more than casual interest. When she stepped outside to investigate, he disappeared down the lane with suspicious haste. "Probably just a vagrant," Sarah suggested when Meg mentioned it over their evening meal of potato soup stretched thin enough to serve 12. "We get them sometimes, hoping for handouts." But 2 nights later, the man appeared again, this time circling closer to the building itself. Meg watched from an upper window as he examined the kitchen entrance, the woodpile stacked against the south wall, the old stable that housed their single elderly cart horse. His movements were too deliberate, too purposeful for innocent curiosity. The following morning, Meg presented herself at the Duke's estate office without appointment, propriety abandoned in favour of growing unease. William looked up from correspondence when she entered, surprise giving way to concern at her expression. "Miss Fairmont? Has something happened?" "I believe someone is watching St. Catherine's," Meg said without preamble. "A man I do not recognise, appearing at night, studying the building. It may be nothing, but after your altercation with Hugh, I thought you should know. William's expression hardened. Describe him. Tall, thin, wearing labourer's clothing but moving like someone unaccustomed to such garments. Dark hair beneath a cap pulled low. I could not see his face clearly in the darkness. I'll have the property monitored, William promised, already reaching for paper to draft instructions. And I'll make inquiries about whether Carrington has hired anyone recently. You were right to bring this to my attention. I do not wish to seem hysterical, Meg said quietly. But I am responsible for 12 children, and caution seems warranted. You are anything but hysterical, William replied, his pale eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Your instincts are sound. Trust them. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things, before Meg remembered herself and curtsied her departure. She did not see William immediately summon his most trusted groundskeeper and arrange for nightly patrols of the orphanage perimeter, nor hear him compose a letter to a private inquiry agent in York requesting investigation into Hugh Carrington's recent activities and associates. The reports that filtered back over the following weeks painted a picture of a man drowning in debt, but revealed nothing conclusive about criminal intent. Hugh owed money to gambling establishments in York, Harrogate, and Leeds. He had borrowed from moneylenders at ruinous interest rates. His behaviour suggested desperation, but not necessarily violence. William filed the information away, increased the patrols, and told himself he had taken reasonable precautions. He did not imagine that Hugh's desperation had already progressed beyond reason into something darker and more dangerous. Meanwhile, the nature of William's visits to St. Catherine's began to change. Where once he had maintained proper distance, arriving only for official inspections with his steward in attendance, now he found reasons to call personally. He needed to review the property boundaries, he explained, to assess the stability of the roof before winter, to discuss potential agricultural use of the surrounding fields. The children quickly lost their initial wariness of the imposing Duke. James discovered that His Grace knew surprisingly much about carpentry and appreciated the boys' woodworking projects. Peter learned that dukes could be beaten at chess if one paid attention to strategy rather than intimidation. Even little Anne, shy as a sparrow, began presenting William with her flower paintings for solemn evaluation. "You have a gift for colour," William told her one afternoon, studying a watercolour of wild roses with genuine appreciation. "The way you've captured the light on the petals is quite sophisticated." Anne beamed, and Meg felt something dangerous unfold in her chest as she watched this powerful man treat a 4-year-old orphan's artwork with the same seriousness he might afford a master's painting. The village gossip reached fever pitch. Lady Beatrice Thornbury proclaimed loudly at the drapers that she had always suspected the Duke possessed eccentric tendencies. Mrs. Crawford speculated to anyone who would listen about whether Miss Fairmont was clever enough to entrap a Duke or merely fortunate in her timing. The vicar's wife fretted about propriety while secretly hoping for a romantic conclusion worthy of a novel. William's family proved less amused. Letters arrived from his aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Haverford, expressing concern about his reputation and reminding him of his duty to marry appropriately. His cousin Frederick travelled from London specifically to deliver a lecture about maintaining ducal dignity and avoiding entanglements with impoverished relations of disgraced viscounts. "You are making yourself ridiculous, William," Frederick announced over dinner at the estate house. "The woman is nobody with nothing, and her father died a bankrupt suicide. What possible good can come from this association? Miss Fairmont runs an orphanage with intelligence, compassion, and remarkable efficiency despite having almost no resources," William replied coldly. "She demonstrates more genuine nobility than most of the titled fools I encounter in London. I fail to see how showing her basic respect makes me ridiculous. Respect is one thing. Mooning about like a lovesick boy is quite another. People are talking, William. They say you've gone soft, that she's manipulating you with tears and helpless children. Your business judgment is being questioned. My business judgment is sound, and my personal affairs are my own concern," William said with finality that ended the discussion but did nothing to silence the pressure from his family and social circle. He ignored them all, driven by something he could not fully name, a need to be near Meg that transcended logic or social calculation. He told himself it was merely respect, admiration for her character. But late at night, alone in his chambers, he acknowledged the truth. He was falling in love with her, had perhaps been falling since that first morning in the market square when he had watched her negotiate for spoiled fish with more dignity than queens possessed at coronations. On an unseasonably warm evening in early June, with 70 days somehow having shrunk to 40, William found Meg alone in the small garden behind St. Catherine's. She knelt among the vegetable plants, pulling weeds with methodical focus, her hands bare and dirt-stained, her hair escaping its pins in curling tendrils that caught the golden light. She looked exhausted and beautiful, and so thoroughly herself that William's carefully maintained composure cracked like overstressed ice. "You should not be working this late," he said, making her start and spin toward him. "The children could help with the garden. The children have their own tasks, and I need something to occupy my hands, or I shall go mad calculating costs we cannot meet and futures we cannot secure." Meg brushed hair from her face, leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek that William found unaccountably endearing. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not hear you arrive." "William," he said quietly. "Please, Meg, when we are private, use my name." The intimacy of it hung between them. Meg rose slowly, brushing dirt from her worn skirt. "That familiarity suggests a friendship I am not certain we possess, Your Grace." "Then what would you call what exists between us?" William moved closer, drawn despite every rule of propriety and sense. "I think of you constantly. I manufacture excuses to visit. I lie awake wondering if you have enough coal for your fires and whether Tommy's cough has worsened. Is that not friendship? Or perhaps something more?" "It is impossible," Meg whispered. But her eyes betrayed her, revealing want and fear in equal measure. "You are a duke. I am the disgraced daughter of a bankrupt viscount living in poverty among orphans. We exist in different worlds. I am a man who has carried responsibility since his father died when I was 24, William said, the words escaping uncensored. A man who has made every decision based on duty and obligation and maintaining a duchy my father nearly destroyed through neglect and excess. I am tired, Meg. Tired of careful calculations and appropriate behaviour, and living as though I am merely a title rather than a person. With you, I remember what it feels like to be human. William! Meg breathed his name like prayer or curse. We cannot. You know we cannot. Why? Because society will disapprove. Society already disapproves of everything I find admirable about you. He reached out, his fingers ghosting along her jaw, barely touching, yet sending heat cascading through her. Because of your father's debts? I care nothing for that. Because you think yourself unworthy? You are wrong. Because I am afraid, Meg admitted, tears bright in her green eyes. I am afraid of hoping for something beyond survival. I am afraid of believing this might be real and discovering it was merely kindness mistaken for something more. I am afraid of what happens when you remember who you are and realize what I am not. William's thumb brushed the tear that escaped down her cheek, catching it gently. What you are is remarkable. What you are is everything I did not know I was searching for. And what I feel is not kindness, Meg. It is considerably more dangerous than that. The kiss happened slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished. But Meg did not retreat. She swayed forward, her dirt-stained hands rising to his shoulders as his mouth found hers with a gentleness that belied the intensity of feeling behind it. The kiss tasted of summer twilight and possibility, of loneliness finally broken and walls carefully dismantled. When they separated, both breathing unsteadily, William let his hand linger against her cheek, his thumb brushing away an imaginary smudge of dirt as though it were something precious rather than imperfect. I will court you properly, he promised. With your permission, I will court you and damn what society thinks. Before Meg could answer, Tommy's voice called from the kitchen door. Miss Meg, Sarah says it's time to put the little ones to bed. The spell shattered, reality reasserting itself with the weight of 12 children depending on her judgment. Meg stepped back, her fingers touching her lips, as though to verify the kiss had truly happened. "I must go," she whispered. "The children need me." "Tomorrow," William said. "We'll speak tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. Not in the way they imagined. That night, at 2:30 in the morning, Meg woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the crackling roar of fire consuming timber. For one disoriented moment, she thought she was dreaming, her mind unable to comprehend the nightmare made real. Then Tommy's scream from down the hall shattered paralysis into action. The corridor filled with smoke, thick and choking. Meg could see orange light flickering from below, hear the hungry sound of flames devouring the old wooden staircase. No time for panic, no room for fear, only the cold clarity of necessity. "Sarah!" Meg screamed, pounding on doors. "James! Peter! Wake up! Fire! Everyone up now!" The children emerged in nightclothes, faces blank with terror. Sarah, bless her, took charge of the younger ones immediately, herding them toward Meg's room at the corridor's end. James and Peter coughed violently, smoke already affecting their breathing. "The stairs are gone," Peter choked out, having checked the main route. Meg's mind raced through options. The windows. Second floor height was survivable with help. She ran to her room, grabbed every sheet and blanket, began knotting them together while Sarah counted heads. 12, Sarah confirmed. "Everyone's here." "Windows," Meg commanded. "We go out the back windows over the kitchen extension. The roof slopes gently there. James, Peter, you go first and help the little ones down. Sarah, you organize them. I'll send them through." The impromptu rope of knotted linens secured to the bedpost. One by one, the children climbed out into the smoke-hazed night. Meg helped each through the window, her heart in her throat, praying the linens would hold. 8, 9, 10 children safely down. Then Anne's scream pierced the crackling roar. "Tommy! Where's Tommy? And Lily?" Meg's blood froze. She spun, frantically counting the children gathered on the roof below. 10, not 12. Tommy and 4-year-old Lily were missing. "The attic," Sarah gasped. "They sleep in the attic room because Tommy was afraid of the dark, and Lily needed him." The attic. Up the narrow servants' stairs at the corridor's far end, through smoke now so thick Meg could barely see 5 feet ahead. The roof would collapse soon, perhaps within minutes. Every instinct screamed to get herself out, to preserve her own life. But they were babies. Her babies, in all the ways that mattered. Meg grabbed a water pitcher, soaked a shawl, wrapped it around her mouth and nose, and plunged back into the burning building toward the narrow stairwell that led to the attic, where 2 small children waited for someone to save them. Behind her, Sarah screamed her name. Below, someone was shouting for help, raising the alarm too late. But Meg heard none of it, focused only on the treacherous stairs and the desperate hope that she would reach them in time. The attic door was hot to the touch. Meg kicked it open and found Tommy and Lily huddled in the corner, crying and coughing. The roof above them groaned, timbers protesting the fire's assault. "I've got you," Meg gasped, gathering both children into her arms. "Hold tight to me. We're getting out." The journey back down the stairs was a nightmare of heat and smoke, and the terrible certainty that any moment the floor would give way beneath them. Meg stumbled, caught herself, kept moving through sheer force of will. Her lungs burned. Her eyes streamed. The children's weight seemed to double with each step. She made it to the corridor, made it to her room. Sarah was screaming from below, other voices joining hers. The window seemed impossibly far, the smoke impossibly thick. Meg's vision greyed at the edges, her strength failing. A beam overhead cracked with the sound of cannon fire. The ceiling above the corridor began to collapse, and then, bursting through the window from outside like something from myth or madness, came William Grey, his face blackened with soot, his coat smoking, his eyes wild with terror and determination as he reached for her and the children she carried. "I've got you," he said, his voice raw. "Hold on, Meg. Just hold on." William had been 3 miles away when the sky turned orange. He had remained late at the estate office, unable to sleep. his mind circling endlessly around that kiss in the garden and what it meant, what he wanted it to mean. The property ledgers lay open before him, numbers blurring into meaningless columns as he relived the softness of Meg's lips, the way she had trembled in his arms. The taste of hope and fear mingled on her breath. Then, through the window, a bloom of fire against the darkness. For one suspended heartbeat, William's mind refused to comprehend what his eyes saw. Then recognition hit with the force of a physical blow. St. Catherine's. He was running before conscious thought intervened, shouting for his horse, not waiting for a saddle. The stableman emerged confused and half-dressed, but William had already mounted bareback, his heels driving into the gelding's flanks with urgency that bordered on violence. The animal leapt forward, hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones as they plunged into the night. 3 miles of country lane, normally a pleasant 20-minute ride, became an eternity compressed into frantic minutes. William leaned low over the horse's neck, branches whipping past close enough to draw blood, his heart hammering a rhythm of terror that drowned out everything except the single word repeating endlessly in his mind. Meg. 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 The orphanage appeared as he crested the final hill, and the sight drove all air from his lungs. Flames engulfed the entire structure, shooting through the roof in columns of orange and red that turned night to hellish day. The heat reached him even at a distance, a furnace blast that made the horse shy and snort in fear. Villagers had gathered in the lane, faces painted demon bright by the fire's glow, their expressions caught between horror and the awful fascination humans feel watching destruction. William searched frantically among them as he slid from his horse, looking for small figures, counting desperately. "The children!" he shouted at the nearest man. "Where are the children?" "There, Your Grace." The blacksmith pointed to a cluster of small bodies huddled in the field beyond the burning building, wrapped in blankets, their faces streaked with soot and tears. "Miss Sarah got them out, all 12, safe as can be." Relief crashed through William with dizzying force. 12 children safe, 12 lives preserved. But even as gratitude flooded him, a new horror crystallized. "Where is Miss Fairmont?" The blacksmith's face told William everything before words could form. "She went back in, Your Grace. 2 of the little ones were still inside, and she went back in. That was near 5 minutes ago. 5 minutes. An eternity in fire." The roof groaned and shifted as William watched, timbers collapsing inward with showers of sparks that spiraled into the night sky like malevolent stars. No one could survive 5 minutes in that inferno. "Someone has to go after her," William said, his voice strange and distant in his own ears. "Begging Your Grace's pardon, but she's gone," the blacksmith replied gently. "No one could live through that. The building's about to collapse entirely." William looked at the burning structure, at the flames consuming wood and stone with indiscriminate hunger, at the smoke billowing thick enough to choke from 50 yards distant. Logic said the blacksmith spoke truth. Reason demanded acceptance of loss. Every calculation of risk versus reward, every principle of sound judgment, screamed that entering that building meant certain death. He removed his coat anyway. "Your Grace, you cannot." Someone grabbed his arm. William shook off the grip without looking, his attention fixed entirely on the building and the woman somewhere inside it. "Soak this," he commanded, thrusting the coat at the nearest person. "Quickly." They obeyed, perhaps from habit of following ducal orders, perhaps from recognition that argument was futile. William plunged the sodden wool into the water trough, drenched his shirt, tied a wet cloth across his nose and mouth. The heat from the building was already painful, and he stood 20 feet away. "If I do not emerge in 3 minutes, ride for Dr. Harrison in York," William instructed the blacksmith. "Tell him to bring everything he has for burns and smoke inhalation. The children will need care." "Your Grace!" But William was already moving, the wet coat held above his head, running toward the flames with every instinct screaming retreat. The heat struck him like a wall as he reached the door. The main entrance had collapsed into burning rubble, but a side window hung open, smoke pouring from it in thick black clouds. William climbed through, dropping into hell. The smoke was worse than the heat initially. so dense he could see nothing, could barely tell up from down. It clawed at his throat despite the wet cloth, filled his lungs with poison that demanded coughing he could not afford. William dropped low where the air was fractionally clearer and tried to orient himself. The staircase. Where was the staircase? Memory supplied an image from his visits, straight back from the entrance, then left to the upper floor where the children slept. But the entrance was blocked, and he had entered from the side, and smoke destroyed all reference points. A beam fell somewhere ahead, crashing down with an explosion of sparks. The floor beneath William's hands was hot enough to burn, and he could hear the ominous groan of stressed timber all around. The building was dying, its death measured in seconds rather than minutes. Then, cutting through the roar of flames, a child's cry. Faint, muffled, but unmistakably human. William followed the sound, crawling through smoke and heat, his expensive trousers scorching, skin on his hands blistering against hot floorboards. He found the stairs by nearly falling down them in reverse. The main staircase had indeed collapsed, but these were the narrow servants' stairs at the back, still intact, though flames licked up from below. William pulled himself upward, each breath an agony, each movement an exercise in faith that the next handhold would not crumble beneath his weight. The upper corridor was an inferno. Fire consumed the walls, and the ceiling had partially collapsed, blocking the far end. But in the doorway of what must have been Meg's room, visible through gaps in the smoke, William saw them. Meg lay motionless on the floor, her body curved protectively around two small children. Tommy and little Lily, William recognized despite the smoke and chaos. The boy was crying, trying to wake Meg, but she did not move. Above them, a ceiling beam hung at a precarious angle, groaning as fire ate through its supports. When it fell, not if, but when, it would crush all three. William covered the distance in a stumbling run, his shoulder slamming against the doorframe hard enough to leave bruises he would not feel for days. He grabbed the beam first, muscle and desperation combining to hold it steady even as the wood burned his palms. "Tommy!" he rasped, barely recognizing his own smoke-ravaged voice. "Take Lily! Out the window! Sarah's below! Can you do that?" The boy stared at him with eyes huge in his sooty face, then nodded with the seriousness of children forced to grow up too fast. William shifted his grip on the beam, using one hand to boost Tommy through the window, the child still clutching his younger companion. He glimpsed figures below, arms reaching up to catch them. Then William let the beam go and gathered Meg into his arms. She was limp, a dead weight that terrified him more than the fire. Her face was pale beneath streaks of ash, her breathing shallow and irregular. Burns marked her hands and forearms, angry red against too pale skin. But she was warm, she was breathing, and William would be damned before he left her to this inferno. The ceiling chose that moment to collapse. William threw himself toward the window as the world exploded into flame and falling timber. Something struck his shoulder with brutal force, spinning him sideways. His foot went through weakened floorboards, trapping him for one endless second before adrenaline gave him strength to wrench free. The coat over his head smoldered, beginning to burn despite its earlier soaking. The window. 3 feet away. 2 feet. The entire building shuddered, structural integrity finally surrendering to fire's patient assault. William could feel the floor tilting beneath him, sagging toward collapse. 1 foot. He drove forward with everything he possessed. Meg clutched against his chest and dove through the window into blessed open air. They fell together, William twisting to take the impact on his own back and shoulder. He hit the sloped kitchen roof with force that drove air from his lungs, then slid, then dropped the final 8 feet to the ground. Hands caught them, broke their fall, voices shouting in confusion and amazement. Behind them, St. Catherine's Orphanage collapsed inward with a roar like the end of the world, sending a column of sparks shooting toward the stars. William lay on his back in the grass, Meg still held against him, and dragged in air that tasted like salvation despite the smoke. Every part of him hurt. His hands screamed agony. His lungs felt flayed, but she was breathing. He could feel her chest rising and falling against his, and that single fact mattered more than any pain. "Meg," he whispered, his voice barely functional. "Meg, please." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. The first thing she saw, when vision cleared, was William's face, hovering above her own. His beautiful face, now streaked with soot and tears he did not remember shedding. His eyes reflecting firelight and something that might have been devastation, or might have been wonder. "The children," Meg rasped, her throat raw. "Tommy and Lily. Safe, all of them safe." William's hand trembled as it touched her face, gentle despite the burns on his palm. "All 12 safe because of you." "You came into the fire," Meg said wonderingly, her smoke-damaged mind struggling to process this reality. "You could have died." "So could you, you magnificent, terrifying woman." William's laugh sounded more like a sob. "Do you have any idea? Christ, Meg, when I thought I had lost you." But whatever he might have said dissolved, as Dr. Marsden pushed through the crowd, his medical bag already open. Reality reasserted itself in the form of burns to be treated, smoke inhalation to be assessed, 12 traumatized children who needed attention and reassurance. The doctor worked with swift efficiency, his earlier reluctance to treat the poor apparently abandoned in the face of genuine emergency. Meg's burns were painful, but not severe, he pronounced. Her smoke inhalation was concerning, but not immediately life-threatening. Rest, clean air, and observation would determine if lasting damage had occurred. William submitted to having his own hands wrapped in bandages, though he refused laudanum despite visible pain. He would not allow his senses to be dulled, not while Meg needed watching, not while 12 children sat huddled in blankets, looking lost and terrified. "They have nowhere to go," Sarah said quietly, appearing at William's elbow as dawn began to grey the eastern sky. At 14, she seemed ancient with responsibility and exhaustion. "St. Catherine's is gone. Everything we had was in there." William looked at the girl, at the children gathered behind her, at Meg lying pale and still beneath a borrowed blanket. The decision required no thought whatsoever. "Pack them into whatever carts can be found," he said, his voice allowing no argument despite its hoarseness. "All of them, including Miss Fairmont, will come to Northmere House. Immediately. Doctor." Marsden's head snapped up. "Your Grace, surely you cannot mean to house them in your own." "I mean exactly that." William's gaze could have cut glass. "Prepare rooms in the servants' wing. No, the guest wing. Proper rooms with proper beds. Send to York for whatever clothing and supplies are needed. And send for Dr. Harrison as well. I want Miss Fairmont examined by the best physician available." "Your Grace," the doctor began, clearly struggling between medical concern and social propriety. "The scandal can go hang itself," William finished coldly. "These children have lost everything tonight. I will not compound that loss by abandoning them to workhouses or parish charity, when I have rooms standing empty and resources to spare. Is that understood?" It was understood. By the time the sun fully rose, painting the smoking ruins of St. Catherine's in merciless clarity, 12 orphans and their unconscious caretaker were installed in Northmere House's finest guest chambers, with the Duke of Northmere himself keeping vigil at Meg's bedside, despite his own injuries. And in a tavern in Helmsley, Hugh Carrington watched the smoke still rising from the valley and smiled. The scandal erupted before Meg fully regained consciousness. By noon of the day following the fire, all of Helmsley knew that the Duke of Northmere had installed Miss Margaret Fairmont and 12 orphans in his own home. By evening, the gossip had reached York. Within 3 days, London society buzzed with the delicious impropriety of a bachelor duke housing an unmarried woman under his roof, regardless of circumstances or chaperonage. Lady Beatrice Thornbury proclaimed to anyone who would listen that she had always suspected Miss Fairmont of scheming to entrap a wealthy man. Mrs. Crawford suggested darkly that perhaps the fire had been deliberately set by the ambitious Miss Fairmont herself, knowing the Duke would feel obliged to offer shelter. The vicar's wife wrung her hands and fretted about appearances, while secretly composing letters to distant relations describing every scandalous detail. William ignored them all with the sublime indifference of a man who had faced cannon fire and found society's censure laughably insignificant by comparison. Your Grace, his housekeeper Mrs. Pembroke ventured carefully. There is some concern among the staff about the propriety of the current arrangements. Then the staff may direct their concerns to me personally, William replied, without looking up from the letter he was composing to his solicitor. Miss Fairmont and the children will remain here until permanent housing is secured. Anyone uncomfortable with that arrangement is welcome to seek employment elsewhere. Mrs. Pembroke, who had served the Grey family for 30 years and secretly admired the Duke's defiance of convention, allowed herself a small smile. Very good, Your Grace. I shall inform the staff that their positions are secure, provided they maintain appropriate discretion and respect. The children adapted to Northmere House with the resilience of youth. Within a week, Tommy was exploring the extensive grounds with Peter and James, discovering a pond stocked with fish and an old oak tree perfect for climbing. Sarah took charge of organizing the younger ones, maintaining routines that provided comfort amid upheaval. Little Anne befriended the kitchen cat and spent hours in the garden painting flowers that the head gardener obligingly did not trim. William spared no expense in their care. A London modiste was summoned to provide proper clothing for all 13 residents. Tutors arrived daily to continue the children's education. The physician Dr. Harrison made regular visits from York, monitoring Meg's recovery and ensuring none of the children suffered lasting effects from smoke inhalation. But while the children thrived, Meg struggled beneath the weight of trauma she could not shake. During daylight hours, she maintained the serene competence that had sustained her through 3 years of impossible circumstances. She ensured the children completed their lessons, mediated their disputes, organized their daily activities. She thanked William with careful formality for his generosity and avoided being alone with him with a determination that would have been admirable had it not been so obviously born of fear. But at night, the demons came. The third night after the fire, William woke to screaming. He was running before conscious thought engaged, his heart hammering, nightshirt discarded in favor of trousers grabbed hastily as he raced through the corridors toward the guest wing. The screaming came from Meg's room, raw and terrified, the sound of someone trapped in nightmare with no escape. He burst through her door without knocking, propriety abandoned entirely. Meg thrashed in her bed, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, her face contorted in terror as she fought invisible flames. The words that tore from her throat were fragmented, desperate. "The children! Tommy! Where's Tommy? Smoke! I can't see! Please! Someone help them!" "Meg!" William crossed to her bed and gripped her shoulders firmly, trying to break through the nightmare's hold. "Meg! Wake up! You're safe! The children are safe!" Her eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. For a moment, she did not recognize him, saw only another figure in the darkness, and she struck out with the feral strength of pure panic. Her fist connected with William's jaw hard enough to snap his head sideways. "Meg, it's William. You're safe. You're at Northmere House. The fire is over." Recognition filtered slowly into her eyes, followed immediately by horror at what she had done. "William, oh God, I hit you. I'm so sorry, I thought—" "I know what you thought." William released her shoulders but did not move away, kneeling beside her bed so their faces were level. "The nightmares?" Meg nodded, tears streaming down her face now that wakefulness had restored control. "Every night, I'm back in the fire, and I can't find them, and the smoke is so thick I can't breathe, and I know they're dying and it's my fault." "Stop." William's voice cut through her spiraling panic with gentle firmness. "None of it was your fault. You saved them, Meg. All 12 of them are alive because you ran into fire when any sane person would have fled. But they wouldn't have needed saving if I had been more careful, if I had seen the danger sooner, if you had done anything differently, you would still be blaming yourself for some imagined failure." William reached out slowly, giving her time to refuse, and took her trembling hands in his bandaged ones. "This is what trauma does, Meg. It tells lies that feel like truth. But I was there. I saw what you did. You were magnificent and brave and utterly selfless. You came into the fire," Meg whispered, her grip tightening on his hands. "You could have died, William. For me. Why would you do that?" For a long moment, William said nothing. The room was dark, except for moonlight filtering through gauze curtains, painting Meg's face in silver and shadow. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, her nightgown modest but thin enough that he could see her rapid breathing. Every rule of propriety screamed that he should leave immediately, that being in her bedchamber in the middle of the night was unconscionable regardless of circumstances. But William was done with propriety, done with rules that prioritized appearance over humanity, convention over truth. Because when I thought I had lost you, he said quietly, I realized that nothing else matters. Not my title, not my responsibilities, not society's expectations. None of it means anything if you are not in the world. Meg's breath caught audibly. William, you cannot mean that. I have never meant anything more. He raised her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles despite the pain it caused his burned palms. I am falling in love with you, Meg. Perhaps I have been falling since that first morning when you negotiated for spoiled fish, with more dignity than queens possess. Certainly I was lost the moment you looked at me in that garden and let me see the woman beneath the armor you wear. I am nobody, Meg protested, even as tears continued to stream down her face. I have nothing to offer you. My presence here is already causing scandal that could damage your standing. If you declare affection for me publicly, society will destroy us both. Then let them try. William's voice carried the steel that had made him a formidable officer during the war. I have faced cannon fire and cavalry charges, political machinations and financial ruin. I am not afraid of drawing room gossips and their petty judgments. But I am afraid, Meg admitted, the words breaking on a sob. Afraid of trusting happiness after flames and smoke. Afraid that if I reach for anything beyond simple survival, the world will punish my presumption again. Afraid that one misstep will hurt you or the children and prove every cruel whisper about me correct. You have failed no one. William released her hands to cup her face instead, thumbs brushing away tears with infinite gentleness. Your father's choices were his own. The fire was arson, not accident. You carry responsibility that was never yours to bear. When will you allow yourself to accept that you are enough exactly as you are? I don't know how, Meg whispered. Then let me show you. The kiss was different from the one in the garden, less desperate passion and more tender promise. William kissed her with the controlled intensity of a man who had nearly lost everything that mattered, who now held something precious and refused to take it for granted. Meg responded tentatively at first, then with growing certainty, her hands sliding into his hair as years of loneliness and fear dissolved beneath the warmth of being wanted, being chosen, being loved. When they finally separated, both breathing unsteadily, William cradled her face between his bandaged hands and pressed a lingering kiss to her brow. I will court you properly, he promised. With your permission, I will make my intentions clear to all of society and dare them to object. But first, you need to heal, both your body and your mind. Will you let me help with that? I don't know if I can, Meg admitted. The nightmares will fade with time and safety. Doctor, Harrison says they are normal after such trauma. But Meg, you need not face them alone. If the nightmares come, I will be here. If you need reassurance, I will provide it. You have spent 3 years carrying impossible burdens without support. Allow me to share the weight. That is most improper, Meg said. But there was no real protest in her voice. Yes, William agreed. It absolutely is. Do you want me to leave? Meg's answer was to shift over in the bed, making space beside her. Stay, please, just until I fall asleep again. William knew he should refuse, knew that if discovered he would be ruined socially regardless of the innocence of his intentions. But Meg looked at him with trust and need in equal measure, and he found himself powerless to deny her anything. He lay beside her above the covers, fully clothed, maintaining every propriety possible under impossible circumstances. Meg curled against his side, her head on his shoulder, her breathing gradually slowing as exhaustion reclaimed her. William, she murmured, as sleep pulled her under. Thank you for not letting me burn. Always, he whispered to her sleeping form. I will always come for you. He meant to leave once she was deeply asleep. Truly he did. but the warmth of her against him, the rightness of her presence, kept him anchored. For the first time in years, William felt the terrible loneliness that had defined his life as Duke lifting. Here, in this quiet darkness, holding a woman society deemed unsuitable, he felt more himself than he ever had in ballrooms full of appropriate matches and political manoeuvring. Dawn found them still tangled together, and it was Sarah's shocked gasp from the doorway that finally woke them both. "Miss Meg, Your Grace, I came to check." "Oh dear." William and Meg separated with guilty haste, both flushing crimson. The situation looked far worse than its reality, and Sarah's wide eyes promised that this particular scandal would spread through the household within hours. "Sarah," Meg began, but William cut her off with unexpected calm. "Miss Sarah, I apologize for the impropriety. Miss Fairmont was suffering nightmares about the fire, and I remained to provide comfort until she could sleep. Nothing inappropriate occurred." Sarah looked between them, clearly weighing truth against appearance. Finally, surprisingly, she smiled. "Of course, Your Grace. Miss Meg has been suffering terribly at night. It is kind of you to offer assistance." She curtsied and backed toward the door. "I shall tell the others you were acting as her physician prescribed, ensuring she rested properly after the trauma." When she had gone, Meg and William looked at each other and burst into slightly hysterical laughter. "That girl is too intelligent for her own good," William said. "She knows exactly what happened and is choosing to protect us," Meg replied. "Oh God, William, this is a disaster." "No," William said firmly. "This is merely accelerating an announcement I intended to make anyway." He stood and offered his hand. "Get dressed. We have matters to attend to." 3 hours later, official notice appeared in the London papers and local Yorkshire gazettes. His Grace the Duke of Northmere announced his intention to court Miss Margaret Fairmont, daughter of the late Viscount Fairmont, with marriage as the presumed outcome of said courtship. The scandal exploded with predictable fury, and William faced it with a smile that suggested he was rather enjoying the chaos. The investigation into the fire moved with the inexorable weight of justice finally engaged. Within a week of the blaze, the magistrate's office had identified both men Hugh Carrington had hired to set the fire. One, a criminal named Thomas Graves with a history of petty theft and assault, fled north towards Scotland and was captured attempting to board a ship in Newcastle. The other, a dock worker named Edward Mills, who had fallen into debt and desperation, presented himself voluntarily to the authorities after his conscience proved stronger than his fear. Mills's testimony was damning in its specificity. He described how Hugh had approached him in a tavern, offered £20 to start fires at multiple points in St. Catherine's Orphanage, provided detailed instructions about timing and accelerants. Mills had believed the building would be empty, he claimed, had been assured repeatedly that the children would be relocated before the fire. When he learned they had nearly died, he confessed, the weight of potential murder became unbearable. He said it was just property, Mills told the magistrate, his voice breaking. Said nobody would be hurt, that it was about money and teaching someone a lesson. "I needed the coin desperately, sir, but I never meant for children to die. Never." Hugh Carrington was arrested on a Tuesday morning as he prepared to flee to France. William had ensured that the ports were watched, that Hugh's description circulated among customs officials and harbour masters. When the constables arrived at the Three Crowns Tavern, they found Hugh burning papers in his room's small fireplace, destroying evidence that would never fully disappear. The trial became a sensation that gripped not just Yorkshire, but all of England. Newspapers devoted entire pages to the testimony, to the shocking details of a gentleman attempting to murder 12 orphaned children for financial gain. Artists sketched courtroom scenes that were reproduced and sold on street corners. The public gallery filled daily with spectators eager to witness aristocratic downfall. Meg was required to testify, an ordeal she approached with visible dread despite William's constant support. On the appointed day, she entered the courtroom in a modest grey dress borrowed from William's housekeeper, her hair pulled back severely, her face pale but composed. Hugh sat in the defendant's box, his once handsome features now gaunt with stress and fear, his expensive clothing unable to disguise the desperate man beneath. "Miss Fairmont," the prosecutor began gently. Please describe for the court the night of the fire. Meg's hands trembled in her lap, but her voice remained steady as she recounted waking to smoke and flames, the desperate race to save the children, the moment she realized Tommy and Lily were still trapped. Her testimony was factual, almost clinical, until the prosecutor asked what she remembered of the fire's aftermath. I remember the Duke, Meg said quietly, her eyes finding William in the gallery. I remember opening my eyes and seeing his face, and knowing that he had risked his life to save mine. I remember all 12 children crying but alive. And I remember wondering why anyone would deliberately try to destroy something so innocent. Hugh's defense attempted to paint Meg as a woman with questionable morals who had manipulated both the Duke and public sympathy, whose testimony was therefore suspect. But the attorney's insinuations collapsed beneath the weight of physical evidence, witness testimony, and Hugh's own letters discovered in his rooms detailing debts and schemes. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts, attempted murder of 13 persons, arson, conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge, an elderly man whose grandson had died in a workhouse fire years before, showed no mercy in sentencing. Mr. Carrington, he intoned with cold precision, you have demonstrated a depravity that shocks the conscience of this court. You attempted to murder 12 innocent children and a woman who had done nothing but care for them, purely for financial gain. The law allows me to sentence you to transportation or hanging. I choose neither. You will serve 20 years imprisonment with hard labour, and upon your conviction, your right to administer the Fairmont estates is forfeit pending determination of rightful succession. Hugh's face drained of all colour. 20 years. He would be past 60 when released, ruined in health and reputation, possessing nothing. He turned his gaze to Meg, and she saw hatred there so pure it made her breath catch. This is your fault, he hissed, as constables moved to take him away. You and your pathetic charity work and your manipulation of powerful men. You destroyed me. No, William's voice rang clearly from the gallery, silencing the courtroom's murmurs. You destroyed yourself through greed and moral bankruptcy. Miss Fairmont merely survived your attempts to murder her. Hugh was dragged away, still shouting threats that dissolved into incoherent rage. The gallery erupted in discussion. The judge gavelled for order, and Meg sat trembling in the witness box until William reached her, his presence anchoring her through the storm of emotion. The legal resolution of Hugh's property proved complex. As he had inherited the Viscount Fairmont title and estates through legitimate succession, simple conviction did not automatically strip those rights. However, the Crown could and did appoint a trustee to manage the properties during his imprisonment, with revenues used to settle his considerable debts. What remained after creditors were satisfied would theoretically be Hugh's upon release. Though few believed he would survive 20 years of hard labour, William watched this process with the calculating mind that had made him successful in both military strategy and estate management. 3 weeks after the trial concluded, he made an offer to the Crown's trustee. He would purchase the Fairmont properties at fair market value, clearing Hugh's remaining debts and providing a small pension for his eventual release. The money would go into trust, untouchable by Hugh, but generating modest income. The trustee, relieved to resolve the complicated situation cleanly, agreed within days. William then did something that shocked even his own solicitors. He transferred ownership of the main Fairmont property to Margaret Fairmont outright, as a gift with no conditions or requirements. Your Grace, his solicitor Mr. Whitmore protested, surely this is precipitous. Miss Fairmont is not yet your wife. If the courtship should end, it will not end, William said firmly. And even if it did, which it will not, Miss Fairmont deserves to have something of her family's legacy restored. Her father's debts destroyed her prospects and forced her into poverty. This corrects a measure of that injustice. But the property is worth nearly £8,000. I am aware of its value, Whitmore. Process the papers. When Meg learned of the gift, she appeared in William's study, white-faced and furious in a way he had never witnessed. You cannot do this, she said without preamble. I will not accept charity disguised as restitution. It is not charity, William replied calmly, setting aside his correspondence. It is justice. Your father's property should never have been lost to Hugh's inheritance. You, as his legitimate daughter, had stronger claim than a distant cousin. The law says otherwise. The law is often wrong. William rose and moved around the desk toward her. Meg, you have sacrificed everything for those children. You lived in poverty, endured public scorn, nearly died in flames. Please, for once, allow yourself to receive something good without questioning whether you deserve it. But what will people say? That I trapped you into marriage by accepting expensive gifts? People will say whatever malicious nonsense they wish regardless of facts. William took her hands gently, mindful of the healing burns still wrapped in light bandages. I do not give you this property to trap you or obligate you. I give it because it should have been yours all along. What you do with it is entirely your choice. Meg's anger dissolved into tears she had been holding since the trial, since the fire, since the moment she realized how close they had all come to death. William pulled her into his arms and let her cry against his shoulder, offering the silent support of his presence. I am so tired of being afraid, Meg whispered when the tears finally subsided. Afraid of hoping, afraid of accepting happiness, afraid that everything good will be torn away. I know, William said softly. Trauma does that. It teaches us that safety is an illusion and hope a weakness. But Meg, you are safe now. Hugh is imprisoned. The children are provided for. And I am not going anywhere. Your family hates me, Meg said, pulling back to look at him. Your aunt wrote 3 letters demanding you end the courtship. Your cousin Frederick travelled from London specifically to tell you I am unsuitable. What? My family is composed of people who value propriety over substance, William replied. I told them in very clear terms that my personal affairs are not subject to committee approval. Several took offence and have ceased communication. I consider this an improvement. Despite everything, Meg laughed, a watery sound but genuine. You are impossible. Yes, I have been told that before. William's expression grew serious. Meg, I want to ask you something important, but I need you to understand that your answer will not affect the property transfer or the children's situation. Those are secured regardless of your response. What do you want to ask? William led her to the window overlooking the gardens where children played under Sarah's watchful supervision. Tommy chased Peter around the fountain while Anne picked flowers. The scene was peaceful, domestic. Everything Meg had dreamed of providing but thought impossible. Will you marry me? William asked simply. Not because of obligation or gratitude, not because society expects it or your situation requires it. Marry me because you want to spend your life with me as I want to spend mine with you. Marry me because you love me as I love you. William, I know you are afraid, he continued, before she could voice another objection. I know you think yourself unworthy, though you are wrong. I know you fear I will realize my mistake and regret choosing you. But Meg, I have made many decisions in my 34 years. I have led men in battle, managed vast estates, navigated Parliament's politics. I know my own mind, and I know that you are the finest person I have ever met. Meg stared at him, this powerful duke who could have chosen anyone, who had instead chosen a penniless orphanage director with a scandalous family history. I am not a suitable duchess. You are the only duchess I want. William took something from his desk drawer, a small velvet box that made Meg's heart skip. This belonged to my mother. She wore it for 40 years of marriage to a man who did not deserve her patience or loyalty. I would be honored if you would wear it as my wife, as partner in a marriage based on genuine affection rather than social obligation. The ring was beautiful in its simplicity, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, the gold band worn smooth by decades of wear. Meg looked at it, then at William, then out the window at the children who depended on her. If I say yes, she whispered, everything changes. For them, for me, for you. Everything has already changed, William replied. The question is whether we face that change together or separately. Meg took a shaking breath, feeling the weight of fear and hope warring within her. She thought of the fire, of William running into flames for her, of his steadfast support through nightmares and trials. She thought of 3 years of lonely struggle and the sudden, unexpected gift of partnership with someone who saw her truly. "Ask me again," she said. "Ask me properly." Pfft. William's smile was brilliant as he dropped to one knee, an absurdly formal gesture in his own study, but one that made Meg's heart swell. "Margaret Fairmont, daughter of the late Viscount Fairmont, director of orphans and the bravest woman I know, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Meg said. And this time there was no hesitation, no fear, only certainty. "Yes, William, I will marry you." The ring slid onto her finger perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her all along. William rose and kissed her with a gentleness that promised safety, passion, and partnership in equal measure. Outside, the children's laughter drifted through the window, a reminder of what they had all survived and what future they might build together. Society's reaction to the formal engagement announcement was predictably divided. Some praised William's nobility in rescuing and marrying a fallen woman. Others condemned him for debasing his title through inappropriate attachment. But increasingly, particularly among younger members of the ton and those who valued character over pure bloodline, admiration grew for a duke who had chosen love and principle over social calculation. The wedding, William and Meg agreed, would wait until a new St. Catherine's Orphanage could be built. It seemed fitting, somehow, that their marriage should coincide with the children's new beginning. The wedding took place on a morning in late September, 6 months after the fire, when the Yorkshire countryside blazed with autumn colours and the air carried the first crisp promise of winter. Meg had insisted on waiting until the new St. Catherine's Orphanage was complete, wanting the children to witness not just a wedding, but the fulfilment of promises made in darkness and fear. The chapel at Northmere Estate was small by ducal standards, built 2 centuries earlier with honey-coloured stone and stained glass windows that painted the interior in jewelled light. William had wanted a grand ceremony in London, something befitting his station, but Meg had refused gently but firmly. This marriage was not about spectacle, she argued. It was about truth witnessed by those who mattered most. The 12 children filled the front pews, scrubbed and dressed in new clothes that still carried the sharp scent of unworn fabric. Tommy Burke, now 7 and considerably less thin than he had been, sat in the place of honour holding a silk cushion that bore 2 gold rings. Little Anne clutched a basket of rose petals she would scatter with solemn concentration. Sarah, at 15, wore a dress of pale blue that made her look suddenly older, poised on the edge of young womanhood. "Do you think Miss Meg is nervous?" Peter whispered to James as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "Course she is," James replied with the authority of his 14 years. "Getting married to a duke is frightening business, even if he is a good sort." "He saved her life," Anne said matter-of-factly. "That means they're bonded forever, like in fairy stories." From his position at the altar, William heard their whispers and smiled despite the unusual flutter of nerves in his own chest. He who had faced French cavalry charges without flinching found himself anxious about whether Meg might change her mind in these final moments, might decide that the reality of becoming a duchess was too overwhelming to bear. Then the chapel doors opened, and William forgot to breathe. Meg wore ivory silk so fine it seemed to flow like water, the dress simple in design but exquisitely tailored to follow the lines of her figure. Her dark hair was dressed with white roses, and she carried a bouquet of late-season blooms from the Northmere gardens. But it was her face that arrested William completely, radiant with something that transcended mere happiness. She looked peaceful, certain, as though she had finally stopped running from joy and turned to embrace it fully. She walked alone down the aisle, having no father to give her away and refusing to be escorted like property. But halfway to the altar, Tommy scrambled from his pew and took her hand, walking the final steps beside her with fierce protectiveness that made several guests dab at their eyes. "Someone has to look after you, Miss Meg," the boy whispered loudly, "even though you're marrying the Duke." "Thank you, Tommy," Meg replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I am very grateful for your protection." At the altar, William extended his hand to take hers, and the contact sent the same electric awareness through both of them. that it had since that first touch in the garden months ago. The vicar began the ceremony with traditional words made profound by the unconventional couple before him. When it came time for vows, William had insisted they write their own, much to the vicar's consternation. Now he spoke them clearly, his voice carrying through the small chapel. "Margaret, I promise to honour not just the woman you are, but the work you do. I promise to share in the responsibilities you carry and never ask you to diminish yourself for my comfort. I promise to run into fires for you, literal and metaphorical, for as long as we both shall live. And I promise that no title, no societal expectation, nothing will ever matter more to me than your happiness and the life we build together." Meg's response came steadier than she had feared it would. "William, I promise to let you help carry burdens I have borne alone too long. I promise to believe I am worthy of the love you offer, even on days when my own doubts are loud. I promise to be your partner in all things, to challenge you when you are wrong, and support you when you are right. And I promise that the girl who once bargained for spoiled fish will never forget where she came from, or stop fighting for those the world overlooks." There were no dry eyes in the chapel when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife. William's kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise of passion to come tempered by awareness of their young audience. When they turned to face their guests, 12 children erupted in applause that was quickly joined by the assembled adults. The wedding breakfast was held at Northmere House, a relatively intimate affair of 60 guests composed mainly of William's closest political allies, a few family members who had accepted the marriage, and virtually everyone from Helmsley Village who had shown Meg kindness during her years at St. Catherine's. Notably absent were William's aunt and several cousins who had declared the match unconscionable. "Their loss," William said when Meg mentioned the empty seats. "I prefer guests who come from genuine goodwill rather than social obligation." The true celebration came 3 days later when the new St. Catherine's Orphanage was officially opened. William had spared no expense in its construction, creating a building that was both beautiful and functional. The main structure rose 3 stories in warm red brick, with large windows that flooded every room with natural light. Inside, modern heating kept the temperature comfortable even as autumn deepened toward winter. Proper bathrooms on each floor eliminated the need for chamber pots and outdoor privies. The dormitories housed 4 children each, rather than the cramped arrangements of the old building, and a spacious classroom occupied the entire east wing. But it was the library that made Meg cry when she first saw it, a room lined floor to ceiling with books purchased specifically for children. William had consulted educators in London and York, building a collection that ranged from primers for the youngest to advanced texts in mathematics, history, and natural philosophy for older students. "Every child deserves access to knowledge," William explained, as Meg ran her fingers along the spines with wondering reverence. "Your old library was admirable but inadequate. This one will serve generations." The dedication ceremony drew a crowd of nearly 200, including several members of Parliament, whom William had convinced to tour the facility and consider similar projects in their own districts. The Archbishop of York blessed the building. The local magistrate who had presided over Hugh Carrington's trial gave a speech about justice and redemption, and 12 children cut the ribbon to officially open the doors, their faces glowing with pride at this home they had helped design through their suggestions and requests. "I want everyone to have enough blankets," Anne had said during the planning stages, remembering cold nights in the old orphanage. Now each bed boasted quilts so thick and warm that winter would be met with comfort rather than dread. William established a permanent endowment fund of £10,000, the interest from which would support St. Catherine's operations indefinitely. Additional donations from inspired guests swelled the fund by another £3,000 within a month. The new orphanage would never face the desperate poverty that had defined the old. Meg retained her position as director, a decision that scandalised some members of society, but which William supported absolutely. 3 mornings each week, the Duchess of Northmere could be found in the orphanage classroom, teaching history and literature to children who hung on her every word. William joined her frequently, discovering a talent for making mathematics engaging through practical applications that mystified academic tutors. If Tommy has 3 apples and gives one to Anne, but then Peter gives him 2 oranges, "How many pieces of fruit does Tommy possess?" William asked during one lesson, and was delighted when even the youngest children eagerly calculated answers. The months that followed their marriage settled into patterns that felt increasingly like genuine partnership. Meg managed the orphanage and gradually assumed responsibilities in William's other charitable ventures, bringing her practical experience to projects that had previously been administered by well-meaning but ineffectual committees. William found that discussing estate management with Meg yielded insights he had never considered, her years of stretching inadequate resources making her remarkably creative in identifying efficiencies and improvements. They argued occasionally, both possessing strong wills and definite opinions. But they had learned to argue productively, seeking solutions rather than victories. And they loved with the intensity of people who had nearly lost each other, who understood that happiness was precious precisely because it was fragile. 3 years after the wedding, Meg stood in the garden of St. Catherine's Orphanage, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their second child grew, watching 2-year-old Edmund play with the orphans who made no distinction between the Duke's son and themselves. The boy had his father's blonde hair and his mother's green eyes, and a laugh that reminded Meg daily of joy's possibilities. The orphanage now housed 20 children, its reputation for excellent care having spread through Yorkshire and beyond. They received inquiries weekly from parishes seeking placements for orphans, and Meg was already discussing with William the possibility of expanding the building or establishing a second location. "We cannot save every child," William had said during their most recent conversation about expansion. "But perhaps we can create a model that others will follow." It was this impulse, this belief that their personal experience of trauma and rescue could translate into systemic change, that had come to define their marriage and their work. In his prison cell in York, Hugh Carrington served his sentence in the brutal conditions of hard labour, his health deteriorating as the years passed. The properties he had inherited were long gone, sold by the Crown to settle his debts. He would emerge from prison eventually, broken and destitute, facing a world that had moved on without him. Some might have pitied him. Meg found she could not quite manage that generosity, though she no longer wasted energy on hatred either. Hugh had become irrelevant, a cautionary tale rather than an active threat. Night was falling over the orphanage grounds when William found Meg in the upstairs corridor, checking to ensure each child was properly tucked in and warm. This nightly ritual had continued even after their marriage. Meg's need to personally verify their safety, a legacy of the fire that William understood without need for explanation. "They are all asleep," William said softly, coming up behind her to rest his hands on her shoulders. "Sarah did the evening check just an hour ago." "I know," Meg replied, leaning back against him. "But I needed to see for myself." William turned her gently in his arms, his hands moving to cradle the swell of her pregnant belly. Inside, their daughter, for Dr. Harrison was quite certain of the child's sex, kicked vigorously against his palm. "She is strong," William observed, "like her mother." "She is impatient," Meg countered, "like her father." They stood together in the quiet corridor, listening to the peaceful sounds of sleeping children and feeling their own child move between them. It was not the life either had imagined in their youth. It was infinitely better. "Do you ever regret it?" Meg asked, voicing a fear she still carried despite 3 years of evidence to the contrary. "Choosing me? Taking on all of this?" "Every day," William said solemnly. And when Meg stiffened in shock, he smiled and continued. "Every day I regret that I did not meet you sooner, that we lost years we might have spent together, that you endured so much alone before I found you." "You ran into fire for me," Meg whispered, the memory still capable of stealing her breath. "You ran into fire for 12 children," William replied. "I merely followed your example. We are both utterly mad then." "Perhaps," William agreed. "But we are mad together, which makes all the difference." Below them, in the warm and well-lit rooms of St. Catherine's Orphanage, 20 children slept safely. Around them, in the growing darkness, the estate stretched peaceful and secure. Above them, stars emerged in a clear autumn sky, witnessing this moment of quiet gratitude between two people who had found each other in fire and built something beautiful from the ashes. Their marriage was not a fairy tale. Meg still woke sometimes with nightmares, though less frequently now. William still struggled with family members who refused to accept his choice of wife. The orphanage faced constant challenges of funding and administration. Society continued to gossip about the scandalous Duchess who worked like a common matron. But it was real. It was theirs. And it was enough. "Come," William said finally, taking Meg's hand. "Let us go home. Tomorrow we can save the world again. Tonight, let us simply rest." They walked together through the orphanage, extinguishing lamps, securing doors, ensuring all was well. Then they climbed into their carriage for the short drive back to Northmere House, where Edmund slept under his nursemaid's watchful eye, and where their own bed waited with its promise of rest and intimacy and partnership. The fire had destroyed St. Catherine's orphanage, but from its ashes had risen something stronger, something built not from obligation or charity, but from genuine love and shared purpose. A home for children who needed safety, a marriage between equals who had chosen each other freely, a future constructed deliberately, with care and courage, and the unwavering belief that the world could be better than it was. And in the end, that belief, that stubborn refusal to accept despair as inevitable, was perhaps the greatest legacy of the Duke and Duchess of Northmere, the end.